In this video, we're going to take a look at the helminths, the worm parasites that are important to microbiology and to medical microbiologists. So the helminths, or the worms, that are found as parasites in the body, all exhibit a characteristic referred to as bilateral symmetry. So if you think about, say, this liver fluke here and its body shape. Oops, I didn't get this side. So yeah, I have a hard time drawing bilaterally symmetrical animals. That means that, okay, we're going to start differently. Let's try it up here. So if this is the worm, when you draw a line right to the center of it, you get, if you have any skill as an artist, you get mirror image halves. And one end is somewhat cephalized, which means that it has a head at that end. And so what we see in these worms is a very rudimentary ganglion of nerves up here that act as the brain. And then at the other end we have a tail. And if it has a complete digestive tract, then there's probably a mouth opening at this end and an anus opening toward the rear end of the animal. So that is what we mean by bilateral symmetry. And there are two phyla that are of interest to microbiologists because they contain so many parasites. And that is phylum Platyhelminthes. Platyhelminthes means flatworms. And the phylum Nematoda. Those guys are the roundworms. So flatworms and roundworms are the two primary groups of parasitic worms that we're most interested in this class. So the Platyhelminthes, there are more than 15,000 described species of Platyhelminthes, and they're clumped into three classes: class Turbularia, class Trematoda, and class Cestoda. So the Turbularians are all the free-living flatworms, and so we're not going to even go there with this chapter about them. Class Trematoda are the flukes. These guys are parasitic, and they're parasitic primarily on the liver and the lungs. So there's lung flukes and liver flukes. And then class Cestoda, those guys are the tapeworms that are parasites found in the digestive tract. So they're flatworms because they have very thin bodies. They're very flat. And there's no body cavity associated with them. There's no coelom. So if we were to take a cross-section through a flatworm, you would see something that looks sort of like this, where there's an external surface, there's a digestive tract that forms this internal surface, but in between the two, it's just a solid mass of muscle and other body tissues. So there's no opening, there's no cavity that surrounds the gut itself. So they either have a simple digestive tract that only has one opening. So the mouth and the anus are the same opening, and so they bring in food, digest it, and then the waste material goes back out to the same opening. Or they have no digestive tract at all and simply absorb nutrients directly across their skin. Most of them have a simple nervous system with a simple, I should have said something like simple ganglion brain. So a little cluster of neurons that serves as the brain. And most of them are hermaphrodites. An organism that is hermaphroditic is one that has both male and female sex organs. And finally, they have no circulatory system, and they exchange their gases, so oxygen and carbon dioxide, exchange directly across the skin in and out of their tissues. The second group, the phylum Nematoda, these guys are the roundworms, and there are more than 80,000 described species of roundworms, although very likely there are way more roundworms out there than that. They can be both free-living, living in moist soils or in fresh water and in salt water, or parasitic. Excuse me. There we go. And most of them are parasitic in the digestive tract, although some of them make it into the blood or into the lymphatic system. And these guys have a partially lined body cavity. So if we look at a roundworm, so there's the outer surface of the body, they have a digestive tract, and then there is an opening that, so if this is the skin tissue here, so there's the skin layer, then this is like the muscles that surround them, and then there's this open space called a pseudocoelom. Pseudocoelom is that, went ahead accidentally. So there's that partially lined body cavity. Partially lined because there's muscle only found against the outer skin layer. There's no muscle directly surrounding the digestive tract. They also have a really thick protective cuticle that helps to prevent the worm from being digested by the enzymes that are found in the digestive tract. And because these muscles on the body wall only run the length of the body, there's no muscles that kind of circle around the body, then the best that they can do is kind of thrash back and forth. And so their movement is this very thrashy kind of movement if you see them out kind of crawling around. The females, especially among the parasitic ones, tend to be larger, and they produce chemicals that help to attract males to them, and then they can mate there in the digestive tract, and then the females go crazy, producing tons and tons of eggs that wind up being shed with feces. Okay, so let's take a look then at the different groups. So looking at parasitic flatworms, we'll start with the flukes. Here is a lung fluke. So not probably too far away from real life size. Probably about half that size is what you would find them. And they're found on lungs, and they also can be found in the bile ducts of the liver. So most of the ones that are liver parasites are living in the bile ducts. The blood flukes, like schistosoma here, the worm that causes schistosomiasis, they are found in the blood at some stage of their life. Schistosoma will insist in muscle tissue, but they are transported throughout the body in the blood, and so that's why they get that name, blood flukes. They have super complex life cycles, and frequently multiple hosts are produced. So when they mate, they produce fertilized eggs that are found in a resistant shell, and the eggs pass from the definitive host with feces. And then they hatch into a free-swimming form out there in the wild, in the environment, called a miracidium. And they're found in freshwater. So these miracidia are swimming around in freshwater, and, misspelling right there, take that R out. The miracidia then can penetrate into the tissues of a snail or some other mollusk host, and as they penetrate, they migrate to the host's digestive glands and produce these sporocysts in the host's digestive gland. Over time, as they mature and develop, the sporocyst transforms into something called a rhedia, and then on into something called a cercaria that leaves the host body and burrow into another host body. Frequently it's an arthropod, so like a crayfish would serve as a second intermediate host. And so this crayfish then has the cercaria that enter its body, and then they insist in the tissues of the cercaria, forming something called a metacercaria. So the metacercaria then gets eaten by the definitive host, and the metacercaria excyst, so encysting is forming a cyst around you in body tissue somewhere. Excysting is when the cyst is broken open, and they infect the host's digestive system. They mature, so that metacercaria then matures and becomes reproductive, and then they mate in the digestive system, and the eggs pass out with the feces again. So if we're thinking about like a freshwater crayfish, then something like, say, a raccoon comes along and eats the crayfish, and then it is now infected. And then when it poops somewhere, the passing out with the poop are going to be the eggs back into fresh water, and then once again we have free-swimming Miracidia that hatch out. Okay, so that's the lung flukes and the liver flukes and the blood flukes. Now if we think about the parasitic flatworms, the tapeworms, they have some amazing body structures. At the head end, they have a structure called a scolex, and the scolex is equipped with hooks. So you can see the hooks there at the very tip of the head of the scolex, and it burrows that head end into the intestinal wall, and those hooks then they're recurved and they grab a hold of the tissues there. And they have suckers. This one happens to have 4 suckers. You can see them here, 1, 2, 3, and 4 on its head, and those also help it to attach. And then right behind the scolex is a long chain of body units called proglottids, and I'm really not using that term segments very, very intentionally. These aren't segmented worms, but they have body units called proglottids that form right behind the scolex, and they're very small right behind the scolex, but as more proglottids are added, then the older proglottids are pushed farther and farther away from the scolex. And as the proglottids mature, they have they're hermaphroditic. Each of the proglottids contains both an ovary that produces eggs and testes that produce sperm. And as the proglottids grow, they also, the sperm fertilize the eggs, and the proglottids fill with fertilized eggs. So that ovary and the oviducts become just packed with these fertilized eggs. And eventually the connections between the proglottids weaken, and as the host there is passing feces, then proglottids will break off, or they will break open because the tissues of the proglottids become very weak as well, and that releases the eggs with the feces. So there's a bunch of tapeworms that infect humans. Taenia is the beef and pork tapeworm, so there are multiple Taenia. That's a genus name, of course, so there's multiple Taenia species. Hymenolipus is another, that's the dwarf and rat tapeworms that also make it into humans. Oh gosh, Leslie and Dakota, they're going to get me for this. I did not italicize these, so here I am underlining them. Echinococcus is a hydatid tapeworm. They form in their lives other specialized structures called hydatid. Dipylidium, sorry about that, is the dog tapeworm, and Diphyllobothrium is the broad fish tapeworm. So all 5 of these are important as potential parasites for humans. And you can see that some of them are fish tapeworms, some are dog, and other mammal tapeworms. Okay, so here's the tapeworm life cycle, and this, remember, is one of the life cycles that I wanted you to know. So the embryo is developing inside an egg, and the eggs are released from the proglottid either in the digestive system or after the proglottid is passed out of the digestive system with feces. Some other animal then ingests water or food that's been contaminated with these eggs. So, for instance, the cows, if they're out there munching in the field and there's cow poop laying around, then cows are very likely to get reinfected with contaminated grass as they're eating. So the eggs hatch and the larvae burrow directly through the intestinal wall, and they get into the blood system and migrate out to other tissues. Once they're in those tissues, they can develop into a cysticercus. If they remain, though, some of them remain in the intestinal wall, and there they can form a cysticercus, a bladder worm, that's in the intestinal wall or the tissue of another organ. Or they can find their way to muscle, and there they form cysts that develop into these hydatid cysts. And inside of that hydatid cyst is a whole cluster of one or more tapeworm scolexes. And so they just sit there and wait then. So they're very patient. And so eventually we slaughter this cow that's been infected with this hydatid cyst. And and if the meat isn't cooked fully, or say you're eating, what is that raw hamburger dish? Oh, I can't think of the name of it. But if you eat muscle that's been infected with these cysts, then now the parasite is inside your digestive tract. And we digest away the cyst from around the scolex, and each scolex then will embed itself into the intestinal wall, begin growing proglottids, absorbing nutrients directly across their skin, and using all that energy then to build new proglottids. And as the proglottids grow and develop, then they produce eggs, as we talked about in the last slide. So that's the flatworms, the flukes, and the tapeworms. So now let's look at the roundworm parasite. They live most of their lives in digestive tracts, and they have to enter the body either in food or water, or some of them, like the hookworm, is capable of penetrating the skin directly. So the ones that are human parasites include Trichinella spiralis, that's the pork roundworm. It causes the disease trichinosis. Ascaris lumbricoides, that's the common roundworm. And if you recall the worm that I showed you that was Grace's, my daughter's, the roundworm that she picked up somewhere, then that's Ascaris. Dracunculus medinensis, that's the guinea worm, and we'll look at some pictures of guinea worms in a minute. They're pretty rough. Enterobius vermicularis, that's the pinworms, super common here in the South. And you may recall my story of talking about how every summer my mother would dose us with pinworm medication because we had spread pinworms amongst ourselves as we were scratching our rear ends where the pinworms had hatched out or where the eggs had been attached right around our the anus. And then now we've got them all over our the eggs all over our fingers and fingernails. And then we go touch everything in the house and put our fingers in our mouth and all that stuff. Enterobius vermicularis is that pinworm. Encyclostoma duodenale, that's the hookworm. And Necator americanus, that's the New World hookworm. So Encyclostoma and Necator are both hookworms. And here, by the way, is the mouth of a hookworm. You can see the cutting plates that they use to kind of slice into tissue to be able to drink the body fluids from those tissues. So there's a lot of variation in the life histories of roundworms. So we're going to focus really on the trichina worm, Trichinella spiralis, as like our example for this. So here we see a cyst that is entering into a human because of poorly cooked pork. And interestingly, we know that pigs tend to be carriers of lots of parasites. And if you look through most of the major religions, many of them have some sort of taboo against eating pork. And what sociologists think about that is somehow a recognition of the fact that pork tends to be a parasite-laden organism, and so by just avoiding eating pork, you're going to avoid a lot of disease. So we see that among the Jewish faith, they don't eat pork. The Muslim faith doesn't eat pork, and they're not the only ones. So you eat some poorly cooked pork. Maybe the bacon hasn't been cooked well, or you're eating a pork chop that hasn't been cooked fully, and you wind up eating one of these cysts. And you digest away the cyst, and the larva is released into the intestine. And then within a very short time, just 2 days later, these worms have matured and are capable of mating. And the females then kind of burrow into the intestinal wall and kind of hang tight there. And they produce eggs, and the eggs actually hatch inside the worm. The larvae emerge directly out of the worm's body. They migrate into lymphatic vessels and then into the blood. And then the larvae are carried by the blood to muscle where they can burrow in, they encyst, and they can remain for many years. That same cycle occurs in the pigs as well. And so pigs are busy eating eggs, and the eggs, or the cysts, and the cysts will decyst or excyst inside their digestive tract and continue the life cycle inside the pig as well, so that more pigs will also be infected. And one of the ways that trichinosis is diagnosed is by looking under the fingernails. And I think in that the slideshow that I gave you the warning about watching, if you are weak of stomach, you might not want to watch it. Then you can see a picture of the fingernails, and you can see through the fingernail bed to the nail bed the larvae that are encysted in there, and this person that has trichinosis. Okay, last slide then. Last thing we're going to say is talk about some parasitic roundworm larvae and some of the diseases these larvae cause. Most of the roundworms cause their damage in the intestine, but there are some that damage as larvae in other tissues. So, for instance, Wuchereria bancrofti, it causes a disease called elephantiasis. And here we can see the legs of a man who is affected by elephantiasis. The larvae find their way into the lymphatic tubes, into the lymphatic vessels. They block lymphatic flow, and without that tissue fluid being able to easily return to the blood, then the extremities can become very, very engorged with tissue fluid, with lymphatic fluid, and with poor lymph return, then you get this sort of grossly enlarged extremities. So, if you look online for elephantiasis images, you will see these kinds of pictures, men with incredibly enlarged scrota, or arms also being affected. Loa loa, that infects the tissues of the eyes and the eye membranes, and they even migrate from eye to eye by crawling across the bridge of the nose. The loa loa larvae and adults are able to crawl through cutaneous tissues at the rate of something like an inch every 2 minutes, so about a half an inch a minute. And so it just sounds really horrible. And again, you can see a picture of a loa loa worm in the eye in the other slideshow. Onchocerca volvulus is one that infects the skin and the eyes and causes a condition called river blindness. All of these, by the way, are tropical parasites, and so they live in warm areas. And then Dracuncula metanensis, that's the guinea worm, and at the end of its life cycle, it migrates to the skin and then forms this really burning, painful blister and a wound right at the skin surface. And the guinea worm will exit the body. And when people who are infected with these guinea worms when they make their way down to the water to soak the foot or the hand or the arm in the cool water to relieve some of the burning pain, then the guinea worm recognizes, oh, we're in water, and that's when it starts to release its larvae into the water. So they are very aware. They sort of force this behavior into the humans that are infected with them. And if you think about that, the image of the caduceus, which it looks like a sword with a snake wrapped around it, there are many who believe that caduceus image, the medical caduceus image, relates to the Dracuncula metanensis treatment, which involves taking a piece of wood or something to wrap the guinea worm around, and then very slowly sort of spooling the guinea worm out of the wound. And again, super, super painful experience. And the guinea worm can be several feet long, so it takes a long time. And what you don't want to do is break the guinea worm off as you're attempting to spool that worm out of that wound. And then last of all, to say that some roundworms are transferred among humans because they exist as something called a microfilaria. Many of these are referred to as filarial worms because of their body types. And these microfilaria are an immature larval form of the filarial worms. And they're in blood, so they distribute around the body in blood. And so if mosquitoes bite you, suck some blood, if they get microfilaria in them, then they can spread them to the next victim host with that mosquito bite. Okay, so there's everything I have to tell you about the exciting worm parasites that affect humans and that are important to microbiology. You know what to do. If you have any questions, reach out, send me an email, and meet me up during office hours, and we can talk about it.